Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is William Duig from Business Review, and I'll be your host. It's our pleasure to have Prism ID here with us today, who will be presenting their webinar, Filling the Gap, How Digital Transformation Should be Embraced When Building Your Next Generation Labeling System. Today's guest speakers are Kevin Bogert from Azimuth Compliance Consulting and Tim Fisher from Prism ID. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar platform On24. You'll notice that this webinar is browser-based, so if you do disconnect for any reason, please just click on the link that you received via email to rejoin the session. In order to ask questions, you can send these in via the questions widget. Just type them into the box at the top left-hand corner of your screen and click Submit. We'll allocate around 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the session to address any questions or thoughts that you might have. Please use the yellow help widget if you require any assistance, and you can move, resize, and maximize any of the windows in front of you to get a better view of the slides. But for now, please allow me to welcome Tim.
Thank you, Will. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Prism ID's second webinar in a series of labeling webinars, which will be presented by experts from the industry and are going to cover the topics of planning a project, resourcing a project, successful implementation, global application, language management, architecture, resilience, and validation. We had the first webinar from this series in January, and it's certainly available for watchback. It covered how to plan the implementation of a global labeling system and how to reduce the validation effort by using your supplier's key strengths. Today, you will learn more about how digital transformation should be embraced when building your next generation labeling system. And our next live webinar will be on the 20th of July, of which you will all receive a registration email. One more expert will present alongside Prism ID, his name being Andrew Love, and he'll be covering how to be EU MDR labeling compliant ready by using the lessons learned from UDI. The series of webinars hosted by Prism ID will help you to choose the right solution and through them reduce the risk, achieve zero defect labeling with full traceability, increase efficiency, overcome technical challenges, improve compliance, avoid costly product recalls, and assisting with consolidation and expansion. However, if you do need our assistance prior to the end of these series, please do not wait. Go ahead and get in touch with us and let's discuss your requirements. Our Prism 360 solution is a powerful, comprehensive, scalable, and validatable labeling solution. With that, I'd like to go ahead and open up with the agenda and the roadmap by which we plan to address digital transformation today. Alongside with Kevin, a strong colleague and friend of mine, we're very glad to have the folks join us today. What we do plan to cover is what actually is digital transformation. Kevin will do a great job at detailing that for us, so by the end of the webinar, we certainly hope you have a full understanding of digital transformation. Also, how digital transformation can reshape every aspect of the modern labeling enterprise. How digital transformation should be considered when defining the requirements for labeling. How digital transformation must be the driver behind breaking down labeling process silos. How digital transformation might be the basis for innovation, flexibility, compliance, and change. And finally, how digital transformation and cloud technologies can work in perfect alignment. We'll go ahead and detail some of the takeaways at the end of the presentation, and as Will said, allow for questions. With that, I would like to present Kevin Bogert. Kevin?
Thank you, Tim, and welcome everyone to the webinar. What I want to talk about today is digital transformation. First, here are some quick definitions of what digital transformation is. Put it in a nutshell, digital transformation is the use of technology to radically improve performance and reach of the enterprise, not the individual departments. Throughout this webinar, I'll be using examples to emphasize points. One example I will be talking about is barcode printing, and the other one will be talking about is order processing, placing an order online, how digital transformation helps customers and companies work together. In the digital transformation world, you go from supplier to customer, customer supplier, all connected in this digital world. The journey is led at department level, but truthfully from the top down enterprise level. It cannot be delegated, it must be led from a C-level person, VP, so forth. How would you know if you are a candidate for digital transformation? This is fairly easy. Do you live with Excel spreadsheets? Collaboration is through email and meetings. Talking interfaces versus data requirements. These are key indicators that you are a candidate for digital transformation. Digital transformation builds on the lean process improvement by combining this improvement methodology with quick changes in IT. Things like value stream mapping, where you break down the process into individual steps and determine if that step adds value. Additionally, when you think of mapping, you look at the enterprise versus department. You map from that process holistically, the whole enterprise, not just a department, not just a small group. What benefit does this stream of that I'm doing give to the enterprise? Another tool within Lean that is used as you do this value stream mapping is SIPOX. Who is the supplier of information? What is the input that they are providing and how is it processed? What is the output I will be receiving from that process? And finally, who is the customer? As you work through every step of that value stream mapping, you would go through this process of identifying the supplier, the input, process, output, customer. You'll be living this. Again, you will define everything from a holistic approach to a change in the organization or enterprise. Okay, digital transformation. It's a cultural change. You all work towards a common objective versus individual departmentized objectives. It's company-wide. Silos are broken down and realigned to the goal of the organization. You think differently, more innovative. You test your ideas to see if they're valid, if they work within the process. You're more flexible to the change. The business becomes agile, meaning quick changes, not waiting months or years for a change. But you think long-term instead of short-term ROI. What benefit of what I'm doing is to the customer or to the product I give to that customer? But it is not top-down. It is led by senior-level management. And then you would look at validation and reducing the validation effort overall, following the Gantt model with some minor changes. The third part of this slide will be handled by Tim. He will be discussing the Prism 360 model and how it works with digital transformation. Tim?
Thank you, Kevin. So today, what we're really attempting to do is take the larger strategy across multiple systems of digital transformation and bring it down to where enterprise labeling fits within that picture. So what we have found through the years is there's really 6 primary buckets of business drivers, whereas companies, when they're taking a look at their enterprise labeling system and the other systems that have to tie into it, these become key components. So on the top of the wheel there, assisting with consolidation. So many of the companies and clients that we work with have very disparate systems. They might have different types of labeling systems that they use across different sites across the globe. None of these talk to each other, and it becomes very tough to really build an enterprise approach to labeling. So we believe strongly that through digital transformation, we can bring those systems together and get them into a centralized application. Enabling expansion. If you look on a daily basis, the mergers and acquisitions that are going on across the globe, the larger companies buying up smaller companies, the complexities related to that, especially around labeling, and of course your contract manufacturers and your OEMs. How do you tie all this together and continue to grow your operation? You have to take a strong, hard look at a system that's capable of scaling and managing those types of changes. Increasing operational efficiency. This really, it boils down to cost and resources and bandwidth and how much availability your company has in terms of resources to throw at the labeling project. What we believe is with digital transformation, you can stand back, take a real hard look at that, at your processes, your inputs and outputs, and really better define a better mousetrap, so to speak. And of course, that's a critical factor in terms of choosing a system like ours. Reducing risk. As all of us know, and I come from industry as well, those of us that are under FDA or EU regulations across Asia, that is such a challenging world. And there's so many opportunities and risks that exist as you try to put your labeling program together and again, tie it to the other systems that are out there. And so Kevin's assertion that we can get that as a single portal through digital transformation becomes very powerful because you eliminate a lot of those possible risk factors, including the human factor. Overcoming technical challenges. Today, we're not going to get into the weeds in terms of the IT strategy and the way that these systems would connect to each other, but on a broad stroke, this becomes an extremely critical point, what we would call the handshake between different systems, talking to each other, working seamlessly together, and at the end of the day, producing a really good labeling result. And then, of course, the all-important achieving regulatory compliance. This becomes a massive factor as you're not only have a business, a commercial business to run, but a business that's highly regulated. And of course, those, as we all know, those regulations are constantly changing. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Will. We certainly do have a poll question that we thought might be interesting to get a result from our audience. Will?
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Okay, yep, it's the time for our first poll question of today's session. So audience members, if you could select the answer that is most relevant for you, and then click submit. Today's question is, have you, in your role, ever considered digital transformation within an IT, regulatory, or operations framework? And the potential responses are yes, no, and not sure. Kevin, if perhaps you could shed a little bit more light on this question just to give our audience a little bit more time to get their answers in.
Yes, when you're thinking about answering this question, and if it's a yes or no, when you think of digital transformation, look for keywords like big data, analytics, collaboration across the platform or enterprise process modeling. These are some of the keywords that you'd be hearing in your organization. If you're still operating in a siloed world and you're not very innovative or you're not very customer focused, then you really haven't embraced digital transformation. So these are the key things when answering these questions you think about, a yes or a no.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Kevin. Okay, so we'll just give a couple more seconds before we push on to the results. Okay, so let's see how the audience members responded. And we can see here that overwhelmingly 73.3% of the audience members said yes, they have considered digital transformation within the given contexts. Does this surprise you at all, Kevin?
Yes, from my experience, it does actually surprise me because many companies have adapted lean, but the change really occurs more in the area of IT, how quickly they deliver the systems that are associated with the lean process we're doing. So I find it a little surprising, but that's good. That means people understand and will hear familiar terms as Tim and I speak. Thank you. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit more about DT and the 4 parts or digital transformation, how they come together: connectivity, innovation, decision-making, and automation. They're equal parts in the puzzle. So who are your customers, and how do I communicate with that customer? These are key. The customer could be internal, external. The customer could be a computer system. Whatever it happens to be. You'll know this when, for instance, if you have built a digital transformation platform, if you're communicating with a customer system, when I have a non-compliance and I'm doing my reconciliation of my labeling, and I have to log into my quality system or communicate with the quality system manually, or when I reconcile the number of labels I use and I log into the ERP system, you haven't achieved digital transformation. When you know you achieved it, you enter one system and the data is transformed and sent to those other systems. You do not have to go to them. On the reverse, the data is communicated to you as well. I don't look for interfaces. I look to say, give me what I need as a customer. Now, when I look at label printing, one of my examples, I won't be necessarily connected to a laptop or a computer. It doesn't matter what the device is. What matters is I just need to print labels at this point. Using Prism's unattended printing with digital transformation, all I need to know is what batch number do I need to print and what's the label format I need. Is it a 3x5 label, 4x6, whatever it is. I just need to know that. I don't need to be next to a computer to know this. I need to be near a printer and say, print to this printer. In addition, using Prism's vision system, it could be checking automatically if there's any defects and communicating to me. I don't need to be standing there waiting for something to happen. I could be anywhere in the plant floor and it could send me a message that there's a problem. If I'm an external customer, for instance, updating the customer as it moves through the manufacturing process or supply chain, from the time you place an order to the time it's shipped to the customer and the final feedback to the customer. Digital transformation is very much customer driven, meeting the needs of that customer. Thank you. Next slide. Innovation. What can I put in a barcode? How can I address the process using better technology? These are things I'm going to talk about here. Using Prism's unattended printing again, we can use multiple types of devices and systems to print labels. All I need to know again is what is the format I need, the label size, and what batch number. But I don't have to log into a system to get this information. This is communicated to me. You have a batch to print, and you need this label size, or you need these 3 types of labels. Which one are you going to print? Now, looking at the barcode, what information am I putting in the barcode? If I look at the regulations, minimum amount of information is needed. But if I look at from a marketing perspective, promotional perspective, or customer, I want to give them as much information as possible. With 2D barcodes available in Prism, I can do this. I can put the customer information in there. I can put the product information or links to it. I can put promotional stuff if I'm buying a lot of this, getting discounts. Once set up and well defined in your requirements, the validation effort to maintain this is much lower. So is the regulatory risk. I'm building in, as I move through this process, different requirements related to connectivity and innovation, as well as decision-making and automation. I need to think in a bigger picture from an organizational enterprise perspective. Next, decision-making. How am I sharing data within applications or systems? Am I building interfaces, or am I thinking of, I'm the customer, what data do I need? If I'm thinking interfaces, I'm not thinking digital transformation. If I'm thinking data sharing, I'm starting to think digital transformation. If I'm thinking analytics, how do I collaborate around those and assign tasks? If all I'm thinking is looking at analytics, but not doing task assignment based on those analytics, I haven't embraced digital transformation. I embrace digital analytics or data analytics, but not digital transformation. The bigger part as well is the collaboration and consensus building around decisions. Digital transformation emphasizes this, but the bigger picture is how best to meet the needs of the customer in the decision-making process. Am I making the right decisions for the customer? Finally, automation. fourth part of the pie. I need to look at it as a holistic approach. If I'm talking in months or years to implement a system or change to a system, I haven't embraced digital transformation. If I'm talking days and weeks to delivery of a change of an IT or the delivery of an implementation, I'm thinking then digital transformation. The world has changed. You need to be, and if you're IT, thinking of it in shorter term. How can I meet the needs of my customers and their customers? Vision systems given by Prism or unattended printing is thinking of this. They're not saying log in and do all this stuff. Instead, they're saying print a label with minimal information because that has already been passed to the application. The vision systems that look at the labeling communicate quickly to you when there's a problem versus waiting to the end to look if the label has properly been printed. How the systems provide data are critical. Are they sending it via interfaces, and every time that interface changes, I need to revalidate? If that's what's happening, your organization hasn't moved to digital transformation. If you're driven from the data perspective, it has. Because all I'm worried about is what information or data do I need to print my label. Now, to tie this together a little bit, we have to look at supplier, process, customer, the SIPOC, the lean methodology. We look at the silos. Are we breaking down these silos and becoming an enterprise-based application or process? If not, we need to. Is it being driven from the top down, priorities set by the needs of the customer and organization, not the individual departments or groups within the organization? When breaking down these silos, the two key lean tools, again, are value stream mapping and SIPOC. You need to know each of the steps and what the inputs and outputs are of those steps and who receives and who sends that information to you. When looking at the supplier and what they provide, the supplier may also be the customer. For instance, if you work with regulatory agencies such as the FDA, depending what your role is, you may be a customer to the FDA or a supplier. If you're in regulatory, you are the customer to the FDA. If you're in quality, you become the supplier of information. The FDA is the customer looking for information from you. You have to identify what role you are, because that changes based on where you are in the organization. When we look at process, we examine the data and how it will be processed. What are the constraints related to the data? If there are any risk associated with the process, and how to break down the constraints and reduce that risk. The key to everything in digital transformation is the customer. Without the sales, all you have is a good idea, a good product. But if you have no one to buy it, you have nothing. Again, customer. We examine the needs of the customer and how best to communicate with the customer and their needs. Example of this is when you place an order online. As soon as you place that order, you receive a notification that the order has been placed, an email. If a process through that whole supply, when it gets ready to ship, you receive another update saying your order has been shipped. If it's a partial shipment, you receive a notification that here's part of your shipment we'll be receiving on this day and a future date for the remainder of it. Again, communication, feedback loops, collaboration are king in the digital transformation age. To you, Tim.
Thank you, Kevin. That was excellent. So from the perspective of thinking again of enterprise labeling, especially in terms of silos, we often see that labeling teams tend to just consider what their immediate needs are. But if you take a look at this picture and you begin to tie all the parts and pieces together as we've suggested, this becomes a very powerful and efficient way to manage your labeling programs. Now, on the left side, you're possibly tied to a PLM system, an ERP system, product data management system, maybe an MES, manufacturing execution, maybe a warehouse system, and even a quality system. So again, that labeling piece has to fit seamlessly around or within these other applications. And that's when you start to really and truly grasp an enterprise level. And again, the goal being efficiency. So if you think about Kevin's four pieces of the pie, are these parts and pieces connected? Are we using innovation to drive efficiency and streamlining? Are we making good decisions in terms of the way that these systems talk to each other and that they're interconnected? And are we making the best use of automation to pull all this data and this labeling information together and attempt to consolidate it? So again, when you start thinking about all of the inputs and the outputs that go with labeling, how these systems need to be fully integrated, and can we potentially connect the entire organization on the labeling front? These are questions that we face on a daily basis. And yes, for those of you who've been in some conferences, we do believe that that labeling utopia, as we like to call it, is possible. Every system talks to every other system and brings that data together for those outputs in terms of accurate labeling. With that, we would like to turn it back over to Will. We have another polling question.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for that, Tim. Okay, so audience members, it's now time for the second and final poll question of today's session. So please do make sure that you get your votes in. The question is, would you say that your organization is siloed in terms of label software applications, departments, procedures, and processes? And the potential responses again are yes, no, and not sure. So once again, so audience members, if you could please select the most appropriate response for you and click submit. But Tim, perhaps you'd like to shed some light on this comment and just give us a little bit more context around the question.
Absolutely. So a lot of times we see silos in terms of departments. IT kind of has their own turfdom. Regulatory has their world. Quality has their world. Operations has their world. And as many of you know, it can be difficult to bring these groups together and get them on a common denominator in terms of thinking through labeling. So is your silos based on departments? Is it based on divisions? Is it based on sites? All of these become very critical factors when you start looking at the organization and trying to figure out how to tie these silos together into consolidation. Our curiosity would be, does your group struggle with that?
Perfect. Thanks very much for that, Tim. I'd also just like to take this opportunity to ask any audience members if they'd like to submit any questions for today's Q&A session. They can do so by typing their question into the box at the top left-hand corner of their screens and by clicking submit. We'll do our best to allocate some time at the end of the session to get around to these questions and answer as many of them as possible. But for now, let's see how everybody's responded to our second polling question. Okay, and once again, a similar percentage as well, that everybody has kind of gone, well, 77.8% of people, in fact, have gone for yes. They would say that their organization is siloed. Tim, does this kind of fit in with your expectations and what you've seen so far?
It does. So this kind of confirms a lot of what we see across the industry, that it's very difficult to maintain that central focus within groups. So thank you for sharing that. That's helpful and again confirms what our thoughts were. Of course, today what we're trying to propose is that there might be a solution to even the siloing issue revolved around digital transformation. So with that, I'll go ahead and continue. As we look across our organizations, typically what we find, and this somewhat speaks to being siloed as well, a lot of times there are very manual processes. So from a perspective of manual, that might be paper-based, as Kevin alluded to. It might be workflow is based on email, notifications is based on email, and I've seen an amazing amount of this still where you still have paper-based files that get moved around. So that's very labor-intensive, very difficult to maintain. Of course, being a manual system, you just can't scale that, because what you have to do is throw more people at it, and you lose control, and of course there's a very high dependency on your tribal knowledge within your group. So that would be the basic process that we typically see, especially with younger companies or startup type groups. Then you go to this local print station. It's usually an off-the-shelf solution. I could name names. You know what some of those solutions are. It's fairly low entry cost. But the problem again becomes as you're trying to scale that across sites or divisions and the company is growing maybe through acquisition, it's just not scalable. It's difficult to set up instances of these types of applications. And we also get a lot of feedback from our customers. These are very hard to validate, especially if they're tied into other systems. And then it sets up a scenario where you're very decentralized. Again, we've seen different sites have different applications, and there's actually no way for those systems to talk to each other. Then you get to the third tier, called partial automation. That would be a segmented platform. There's some automated features, there's some bridges that have been built to tie these systems together. But still with that, you have many sources of truth. You really don't have control over your content or your data or your workflows or your approvals. And, you know, heard the word before, it basically becomes a Frankenstein approach where you're trying to bolt all these systems together. And that becomes very, very difficult to manage from an IT perspective. So what we're proposing today, and we've talked about it as even utopia, is an enterprise label management system that brings all of this information together. And it feeds off other systems or it feeds other systems. It's centralized, it's streamlined, there's single sources of truth, so you're not putting information out in the market through your UDI labeling or IFUs that's inaccurate. There's automated functions. What does that mean? You're reducing or eliminating that human factor, the human touch. And of course, all the parts and pieces that go into labeling come together on a single application. Design, review, approvals, print inspection, reprints, and of course, all within that context of the 21 CFR Part 11 FDA requirements for systems. So that's where we would like to see all of our clients get to, where you work through these phases and ultimately end up with an enterprise system. Kevin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tim. What I want to look at here, based on what Tim just covered, is are you in your current labeling system still stuck in a siloed world? Does your process require validation of each interface? When an application on one side is changed, your interface changes, you need to revalidate or that particular interface. You must be trained on multiple systems, an ERP system, a PLM system, a QMS system, and the labeling system to do your job. Verification of the labels are performed most time by employees looking to see if there's any error versus a vision system, something like Prism's vision system. When I look at next generation, I'm looking at enterprise. I have one process. I get the data because my labeling system at that point is the customer. I need information. But I don't want to have to go to many places to get it. I want one source of data coming to me. Validation is greatly reduced because I'm not looking at all interfaces. I'm just looking at data that comes to me. So ongoing maintenance is lower overall. Compliance concerns go down because I have less interfaces that I'm worried about where the information is coming from and if it's correct. And how I communicate with the users is more automated. Systems send information and assign tasks to individual users versus me having to go into a system like an ERP system and say, what labels do I need to print today? Instead, in the digital transformation age, the system will say, here's the batch that we are producing today, and here's the label formats we will be printing. That task is assigned to you. You print the labels, and the system communicates back when you've completed. The system informs you of any changes that have to occur. Rather than you asking, I need to make these changes, it says, I find problems, I find issues with the data I'm sending to you, or the data you're sending to me. So you think of a holistic approach again, how systems communicate with each other, be it a person or an application. This is moving forward to the next generation, which Prism is taking you to. Tim?
Thank you, Kevin. So let's step back a little bit, and how do we actually accomplish digital transformation? What are some of the factors that we need to consider? Now, many of you, I'm sure, as I have been involved in software projects that didn't go so well. And for the most part, that first top bullet point on the left is really what sets in motion a project that does proceed extremely well versus one that doesn't. And it all resides on your requirements and what we would call that analysis phase. Do you have the right stakeholders? Do you fully understand the inputs and the outputs? And are those inputs and outputs tied to the other systems, as we've discussed today, and the centralized portal, and trying to bring those together? Do you have strong URS documentation, your user requirement spec? These things take time, and they take leadership, and they take change in the way that people think. And this can be a tough part of any project, but our assertion is if you get this part right, you now have set the stage for a very successful project. And of course, I've always felt the strong conviction, and this is an expectation of our teams, we would like sign-off on those requirements, because that really does become that roadmap that gets followed in terms of implementation. So the design phase. Do you understand the platforms and the way that the platforms function? Have you considered, is this going to be an on-premise install? Is it a SaaS approach, or is it a hosted in the cloud approach? Do you fully understand what that system's capable and what it can deliver, almost in terms of a functional spec and what that software is built to do? Does your vendor have the functionality required? This is a critical thought, because if you pick a vendor that really doesn't cover the full aspects of what you're attempting to do with your labeling program and data management, that can be a tough road. And a critical piece of that, we just came off a client visit a couple weeks ago, is the system configurable or is it customized? This was a very important factor for them because their IT department isn't that big. They don't want to be working with a customized application that has to go through constant change in terms of code. We would much prefer a configured system. So that's, again, part of that design development phase that needs to be considered as you look at these projects and start to put some ideas down. And of course, the all-important testing. This is fairly unique to the FDA type world out there, the life science regulated world. Has validation planning been considered? A lot of times we see that up to 50% of a project is related to validation. And so typically what our teams will do is build that validation effort right into the project. So it's just a seamless approach to making sure that you've got a 21 CFR Part 11 system that meets compliance needs. And then I think this is almost one of the most important pieces of a software implementation project. Is the culture ready for that change? Have they been properly prepared? Are they on board? Is there some pre-training that maybe has occurred on the system? If you don't get that culture ready for this change and you go live, that can be a very, again, a tough road in terms of getting a full implementation and getting full buy-in. So that becomes part of that release, and then your ongoing support and maintenance and the way that you have that set up. So these don't apply just to a labeling system. This is the way that you have to look at digital transformation as a whole. So very important piece. This next slide, we're going to shift gears a little bit. It's our fourth topic we wanted to cover, and Kevin's going to detail how this all fits in terms of cloud capabilities.
Yes. Well, thank you, Tim. Yes, cloud technology. Digital transformation is heavily based on cloud environments, rapid change. If you remember back years ago, and the regulatory world is adjusting to this as it moves forward. We had to go to IT. We need a server. It would take weeks just to order the server and get in. Then they'd have to qualify it another few weeks. Finally, we'd be able to call the vendor and say, come in and install the software. In a cloud environment, we look at hours versus weeks. I need that environment up by tomorrow. It's up in hours. It's qualified. They have already all the controls in place. It can greatly reduce your overall validation costs because this is handled at a lower cost by external staff than it is by internal staff. And they're all qualified to do the job that they're doing. Their training is maintained. You don't have to worry about that when you're looking at external as you do as internal once you have done the right things. For instance, if you're looking at a cloud environment, you want to make sure you have audited the host company. You put in place supplier quality agreements. What are they responsible for? What are you responsible for from an FDA or EU requirement regulatory point of view? This is key to the successful use of a cloud provider overall. Some key milestones that have occurred over the past few years. Part 11 came out. They were just addressing siloed systems very much, IT internal. Then Annex 11 came about, and they started looking at IT differently. IT provides a service. They should be treated as a supplier, not part of the organization. Then, 2 years ago, the World Health Organization came out with Annex 5 and said, cloud environments are the direction, and we must qualify these environments. But they do it in very little terms. So they're saying this is happening. Digital transformation is coming. Cloud is a new direction, be it internal or external. And we need to embrace this, but we still need to ensure regulatory compliance. And these agencies have been addressing this, be it Annex 11 and Annex 5 from the World Health Organization. Tim, I can pass it to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kevin. So, kind of wrapping things up here, we certainly wanted to cover what we felt were the 4 key takeaways from today. As you look at what to consider when developing your user requirements for next generation labeling, always consider what your end goals are. How are we going to get from A to Z? Evaluate that risk. Where are these different integration points? And to Kevin's point about digital transformation, is there a single portal that we need to think about so that the operations ease and efficiency and consolidation is there? So stand back, take a look at the bigger picture, and then start working your way through the myriad of questions that you should be asking yourself. How can we do this better, faster, and more efficient than we are currently? Can you build in flexibility? Is there a single source of truth? And we'll talk a little bit about MDR in a subsequent slide, but is your system capable of bringing new regulations and new requirements and regulatory rules together to really assure that the software platform that you end up with is exactly what you need? Second item, how to break down those silos. We talked quite a bit about this. They typically occur within your processes, and by using integrated technology, automation, and digital innovation, is it possible to begin to connect these dots within your organization? Can we bring these disparate systems together? Can we do this under a 21 CFR Part 11 requirement? Can we centralize? Can we pull this data together? Can we pull these language phrases together, regulatory rules? And then even from a design perspective, we see so many of our clients that have external systems they use for artwork and design. So, what we most see is an InDesign, an Adobe type product. And is it possible to even tie your graphics piece directly to your labeling and all of the other systems that bring together information for that, especially the UDI? Workflow. This is such a critical piece of what a system must do for you. Can it drive tasks and create notifications? And then, again, we have to start thinking in terms of digital innovation. Is the cloud the right strategy for us? Third, why building innovation and flexibility into your labeling process will improve your ability to respond to compliance and industry challenges. As many of you know, in May, the EU went from an MDD to an MDR regulation, a medical device directive, and that has now the clock started where companies have 3 years to comply. So there's massive change within that regulation, And so now we need to look back and go back to our systems and say, all right, do we need to make changes to these systems to handle these new regulations? You've got to have a system and a strategy to manage that. The e-labeling considerations, of course, many of the companies that we talk to are going to the electronic IFU, where you post it out on the web. Are systems and the data able to come together and support that? And what this really gets down to is, can we handle mass change events? So again, part of the strength of what we can do with our system is what we call impact analysis, where there might be a pictogram, there might be a language phrase, there might be a new registration number. We've seen it all across the board when you look at China and Japan, and of course the new MDR requirements out of Europe. Can our system manage that change and make that change an efficient, easy process, or is it something we have to do by hand that will take hundreds of hours of resources? Very big consideration. And finally, how reviewing the latest technologies, including cloud-based models, could drive efficiency and reduce costs. Can we reduce those internal costs that are associated with IT or even regulatory or quality because of the amount of effort that goes into labeling? Can we assure that the right label's on the right product, thus reducing recalls, reworks, or worse, FDA-type action? Can we manage through unattended printing? Can we tie ERP, PLM, MES systems together? And in terms of distribution labeling, can we make to stock product, put it in a warehouse, not use a mega label, but instead use a very country-specific label and reduce that footprint and the requirements on our labeling system? So these are all big questions. And as you work through your requirements and start to think about labeling strategy, that we think should be considered. With that, I turn it over to Kevin for a final wrap-up slide, and then we'll get to questions and answers.
Thank you, Tim. Again, remember digital transformation, customer focus, lean, keywords to remember. Flat organization, all these. But the thing is, you need to ask some hard questions. Why do we need to transform in the first place? What do we need to transform? What process? How can we transform? How do we move to this new digital transformation age? People, process, and purpose must drive digital transformation thinking. It's led top down, not bottom up. It's not departmentized, it's enterprise-wide. It looks at efficiency and collaboration as a wave of the future. We need to know, where are we going? Where are we now? What does the future hold? These are all key questions you need to ask. When transitioning to the digital transformation world, what do we need to consider? What's coming? Is it unavoidable? The good thing is, Prism, Azimuth Compliance Consulting, can help you move to this digital transformation age and bring labeling in the 21st century. Thank you. And we'll now take questions.
Thanks for that, Kevin. So we've now come to our Q&A session for today's webinar. Thank you, everybody who submitted questions so far. We do have around 10 minutes left, so we'll try to get around to as many of those as possible. But our first question is, if our current labeling program is struggling in terms of data management and multiple sources of truth, what would either of you recommend as a first step? Tim, perhaps you'd like to take a crack at that one.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you. So from a current labeling program and that struggle of data management, multiple sources of truth, we see that quite often. So the obvious and most important step is really to begin what we would call a scoping exercise. And what would occur in this type of an exercise is we sit down, we really try to analyze what the most important parts of your labeling system might be and where your biggest challenges are. Off of that, we can begin to build requirements around filling in some of those gaps and really putting a full assessment together which again can lead potentially to a URS, user requirement spec, that would define the solution for some of those critical areas. So that would be our first step, is to begin that scoping, start looking at those gaps and challenges, and putting an assessment together to really address some of those concerns. Will?
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Tim. Okay, so we've got another question here. Somebody is asking, being in regulatory, how does digital transformation really affect me and my role? Where do you see it working from a global regulatory perspective? Kevin, perhaps that's more up your street.
Sure. If you remember back, I talked real briefly about the interfacing with, say, a regulatory agency like the FDA. A good example might be like the 510K process. FDA has actually adopted digital transformation in the 510K process to communicate with its customers, the regulatory groups within medical device or pharma. They look at and say, how can we be more proactive? We get a request in for a new medical device to be approved. The timelines start clicking. They wait to the last moment? No. The systems push them. The digital transformation age says, you need to respond back to the customer. You need to be customer focused. Your life as a regulatory person is made much simpler when you're interfacing with the FDA or EU, in that they're being more responsive. The systems are pushing them to ensure that the customer, the needs are being met. If you look at clinical, the same thing. How I communicate with the CROs from a regulatory perspective, or whoever is managing my clinical. Prism ID, they have some labeling printing around clinical, and thinking of the digital transformation age and saying, how can we best meet the needs of the end user of that label, which could be a patient, a doctor, or whoever. Again, you have to think from a customer-supplier relationship. What information do I need, or what information must I provide to move my product along in the process? Hopefully that answered your question with the example I gave you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that. So we have another question here. Tim, this could be more for you. Is Prism able to help our company think through how, let's say, labeling requirements and IT system requirements are linked? One of our audience members has a gap that their internal team seems to be struggling with.
Yes. So quite often we do see that gap between the regulatory organization or the labeling organization and the IT organization, and the way that they would see a solution. So part of what we need to do is work very closely with both groups, and typically that involves operations and engineering as well. So the temptation here, I think, for when you look at just labeling, is to isolate it out and separate it from the pack, so to speak. And that's really counterproductive to what we're suggesting should be done, especially as we talk about digital transformation today. So when you begin to look at what the IT requirements are, what the labeling requirements are, how do you get that group together to start thinking alike? And so I think one of the most successful programs I've seen is where there's an executive governance board, and this kind of gets to Kevin's top-down idea, because it's the VP level or perhaps even above that has to put this strategy together. And so our job from a Prism perspective is not only to work closely with the stakeholders, but really understand the strategic value and what the executive team is trying to accomplish. And of course, a lot of times that revolves around ROI, return on investment, some type of business driver, or even a compelling event that might be driving labeling forward. Perhaps a recall or a big rework, and now there's money that's involved in that fix. The other thing I think that we're seeing more and more of is where these system integrators can become a critical part to these decisions. So you may have somebody from SAP or groups like Deloitte or Accenture or McKinsey working closely with these labeling engineering teams already. And so what PRISM, our team, will do is come alongside of those groups and align ourselves with their strategy. And at the end of the day, we're able to fit within that framework of what they're trying to accomplish. So it can be challenging, for sure, when you try to get your IT and your regulatory teams working with quality, ops, engineering, marketing, graphics. That can get rather complex, but we do have a lot of experience in bringing these groups together, getting everybody on the same page, and certainly getting them aligned as far as how best to implement a labeling system. Does that help?
Perfect. Thanks very much for that, Tim. Thanks, audience members, everybody who submitted a question so far. So please do keep those coming. We've got some great questions. Our next question, one of our audience members, is saying that they work for a medical device company. How would an organization like theirs begin to understand how digital transformation could be used? Kevin, perhaps this one's for you.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, this is a great question. If you remember back the slide about connectivity, we discussed the importance of the customer. Understand how best to communicate with the customer. Again, thinking enterprise level, customer driven. I would start with those processes that are customer facing. For instance, order entry, customer placing an order, and work upstream to determine the systems that feed into the process and output to the customer of those systems using or customer facing. I look at using tools like value stream mapping and SIPOCs as a starting point. But again, in order to be successful, this has to be driven from the top down. Executives need to be on board to say, this is important to us. I use a good example of a company that everybody is familiar with that's heavily into lean from the 50s on. This is Toyota. They're very much embracing the concept of lean in manufacturing process and everything they did. But they still weren't getting or achieving the goals they wanted to. And the main reason behind this were the systems they had in place. The IT systems were not responding as quick. They adapted or took on the whole digital transformation of process, and they immediately seen an 18% increase in already a lean process just by implementing digital transformation. You can do this, but again, look first at a customer-facing application. That's where I would start. Thank you. Hopefully that answered your question.
Thanks very much for that, Kevin. I'm sure that our audience members are going to be quite happy with that quite detailed answer. We do have time for one more question. So I think that question will be, what type of systems do you typically see tied together where labeling software is used? Are there supporting tools that can be used to kind of pull these systems together? Tim, perhaps you'd like to take a crack at our final question.
Yeah, that's another good question in terms of what we're talking about today. So I've shared a little bit as we look out across the globe, across our client base. The typical systems we see are certainly ERP. A lot of times your manufacturing data, your expiration dating, even if there's serialization involved, that type of data might come from an ERP system. A PLM system is a lot of times where that content is held. So if you think in terms of UDI and the different parts and pieces that are critical that have to be loaded and imported to be placed on a label. The other thing we see with PLM sometimes is change. So there may be complex workflows where different groups route different materials different ways, and we are very capable of pushing out the label formats and requirements and allowing a PLM system, like an agile system, to be managed, to manage that part. Sometimes we see MES systems, manufacturing execution, where there's data being driven or we have to push information back out to an MES for the actual network printing. And then we have run into several cases where there's a QMS involved, and where the quality management system might come into play is you've got a repository that can be the storage for your approved label versions. Sometimes we see that it's in the QMS where change control and versioning is managed. And so that those are the types of systems that we typically see. Now, if you think about the components of those systems that need to interact with Prism, it could be data, it could be change control, what we talked about, content, language phrases. A lot of times we see integration points with different language houses where they're bringing in those phrases. And we talked a little bit about artwork even in terms of Adobe Illustrator and InDesign and where that can be imported or brought into the system. Now, as far as tying these things together, there's really three areas of we'll call them bridges that can be built between systems. Certainly the most effective and efficient way is through a web API where there's a task and a call and the information is provided and brought over. A lot of times, though, we see like other systems don't want us to directly interface with their system. So in that situation, we might use a staging table where the information is brought down and then Prism is able to pick that up, or the other way around. Prism drops information into a staging table and another system picks that up. And then, of course, you've got the more old school approach, but it's still very much a viable opportunity, is where you might have an import sheet, a CSV type file, or an XML type file, and those files are passed back and forth between these systems. So in terms of the supporting tools, again, we've talked a little bit about technology. We're very capable of bringing those technologies together, getting them talking to each other, and at the end of the day, eliminating that human factor of touch.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for that, Tim. Okay, audience members, that does bring us to the end of today's session, so thank you very much for joining. I'd also like to thank Kevin and Tim for what was a fantastic presentation, and also to Prism ID for sponsoring today's session. To our attendees, you'll receive an email shortly telling you how you can access the on-demand version of today's webinar, where you can interact with all of the different elements that we have going, and you can keep submitting your questions. Or you can access this through our website, which is www.business-review-webinars.com. For anybody whose questions that we didn't get around to answering today, I'm sure that Kevin and Tim will get back to you in due course. And once today's webinar ends, a survey will appear in its place. So we would appreciate it if you could take the time just to answer the questions provided in there. We look forward to sharing further webinars with you, so please do keep an eye out on the website just mentioned, and follow us on Twitter at BRWebinars for daily updates, and join our LinkedIn group, Business Review Webinars. Thank you once again, and I hope you all have a nice day.